You're dead.
Despite my best efforts not to think too hard about it, a gunshot would linger in the air, or the sound of someone's neck snapping would stay in my mind far longer than it should have. And then the thought would flash in my mind again. Nathan Drake, the charming killer. I wanted to properly articulate why the action of Uncharted in particular bothered me, where in so many other games I'd rack up the same body count without much thought. I'd love to say that the answer came to me after years of study and introspection, but the reality is a bit more mundane. I played The Lost Legacy. In combat, my concerns were more along the lines of run, shoot, think, live. And in the game at large, I never thought that anything that the new lead, Chloe Fraser, did was out of character. It was this change in leads, amongst a host of other changes, big and small, that made the title the most seamless to play through in the series. A game that seemed to finally fulfill the series' ambition of being a playable action movie, and one where I didn't think about the lingering implications of all the murder. What it really highlighted, to me, was the importance of character, and how much of our experience is shaped by who we're playing as. So join me as I try to piece together what made the action of the older games sometimes stick in the mind, and what made the action of The Lost Legacy so effortless to throw myself into. Oh, and be warned, this video will contain spoilers for the entire series. If we're discussing characters, then it's important we establish who those characters are, and what sorts of energy the actors playing them bring to the experience. Nolan North, Drake's actor, was fundamental in shaping who the character is, and gives Drake a very different presence than most other action heroes.
Unlike other games where, like, yeah, we're gonna go kill and get to... He just wants to get the hell out of there.
As Richard LeMarchand, lead designer for the first 3 Uncharted games, notes, most actors that came in played up the tough guy elements, but we immediately saw the vulnerability and doubt in Nolan's portrayal. He offered a different conception of masculinity. I think that's one of the most important elements in the success of Uncharted. And I should clarify, this energy is one of the main successes of the series. Drake, a hero who can admit he's wrong.
Elena, I don't need your bullet-riddled corpse on my conscience. Let's go!
Oh, please! You quit if you want to, but don't use me as an excuse.
Fine. It's me, okay? I am quitting. Are you coming or not?
A hero who's often at his best when he's just hanging out with people.
Hey, you ever wonder, like, the different choices, how we might have ended up?
I mean, like you taking your magic show on the road?
No, that was an option. I was good.
It's not a viable option.
What? You know what? You're just jealous. You always were.
The developers have talked about creating a playable action movie, Drake harkening back to the old action heroes. In that sense, I think they may have failed. A lot of those heroes are probably more accurately categorized as anti-heroes. They have a darkness in them, and that energy is why I can believe, say, Indiana Jones would just shoot a guy. I think Drake is a more traditional kind of hero, someone who I can totally see fighting to protect people but avoids conflict where possible, and definitely wouldn't enjoy it this much. To be fair, he is flawed, and the later games examine his self-destructive need for adventure, but even here, I find the jump from treasure hunter to someone who would pull the pin off some random goon's grenade hard to believe. There's another quote that came to mind while playing through the series, from the creative director and writer of the first 3 games, Amy Hennig, talking about the difficulty of reconciling the way we see the character in the story and in the gameplay. As Richard LeMarchand recounts, she calls it the uncanny valley of narrative. Her theory is, because the acting performances have become so good, it makes the issue of the game parts stand out even more. Which is to say, the excellent work that has gone into developing Drake as a character is also the same reason that some of these kills hit harder.
There's a guy below you, there's a guy below you.
If you look closely, you can see the guard swims away, because, it would be weird if he just killed this hapless guy. These are the sorts of minor moments the developers have to consider. Do Drake's actions in the gameplay reflect who this character is?
We're trying to create characters that have depth to them, right? That have real motivations to their actions. Now, if we allow the player to do things that are inconsistent with the characters or how they are written, right? Then we end up sacrificing the believability of those characters for some quote-unquote cool a jetpack, right? Thus breaking our players' narrative experience.
When the story gets going and Drake gets a bit more serious, I do find the experience is much stronger, because he's acknowledging the fact that he's killing guys and not doing so glibly.
The more the merrier!
I actually find the combination of vulnerability and seriousness a bit more relatable. Someone who is good to the people around him, but who is also willing to finish a fight when he's forced into one.
You want the treasure, Rafe? It's all yours.
It's a side of his character that doesn't really appear enough, but the moments where he seemed genuinely angry or distressed during a fight felt much more in keeping with my view of him. Even just a single line could sell me on the gravity of the situation.
That one's for Sully.
But it's not constant, and much of the weirdness, especially in the early parts of these games, stems from the sense that he's being put into situations that just don't fit for him. A hero trying to fill the role of an anti-hero. So, if you were to make a game where one of the main activities was shooting like a billion dudes, and you want the player not to think too hard about it, you'd want a protagonist where these sides could more easily coexist. Someone who is still likable, who would ultimately do the right thing, but with enough of an edge that you could see them just killing someone. And I think that someone ended up being Chloe Frazier.
Let's get one thing straight. This is my gig. You want your share? We play by my rules.
Frazier is also a roguish treasure hunter, but one I can actually believe in. In her appearances throughout the series, you get a much stronger sense of who she is. Someone who is torn between doing the right thing and her own survival.
Okay, you tried, but it's over. He can't go any further.
We can't just leave him here to die.
He is as good as dead already, and so are we if we don't go now.
I can believe that Chloe, a character who spent a great deal of Uncharted 2 just trying to get out alive and bowed out of Uncharted 3 when things got too dangerous, would be comfortable with killing in a way that just never registered with Nathan. The word that Claudia Black used to describe her character was cavalier, and I think that attitude was what sold me on Frazier as the new lead.
So that's a no. Felt like a no.
All the quips and snappy dialogue feel far more natural coming from her, and not quietly psychotic as it could sometimes sound coming from Drake.
Now I guess we turn this crank and see what happens next.
Think it's safe?
You know that treasure hunting is not a good gig for the risk of us, right?
Neither is being a mercenary. Difference is when I pull the pin on Grenade, I'll know what's going to happen next.
My way's much more fun.
It just seems like another day in the life of an action anti-hero. And that brings up another point. Uncharted doesn't always play like an action movie. I'm about to say something very obvious. Uncharted is a cover shooter. Well, duh, you say, as was the style of the time. But I think this has had a dramatic impact on the way the action plays out, and the way it feels to participate in. The developers cite titles like Gears of War and Killswitch as inspirations. Games that, despite their sci-fi elements, are designed around a cover system that conveys a sense of tactical realism, hunkering down behind a concrete barrier to avoid suppressing fire, like a soldier in a combat zone. Which is why I think the action of Uncharted sometimes finds itself at an impasse, evoking action cinema where the heroes throw themselves into the middle of danger, but working within a combat system that encourages you to play in a safe, practical manner. I found trying to pull off a stunt in the earlier games oftentimes unviable, at least unnormal. The enemy force is so lethal, and Drake's health limited enough that the lesson I took from death was, oh, should have stayed in cover. And this is a common criticism of the series, with channels such as Nova Canoe and Turbo Button going into great depth on the mechanical limitations of Uncharted's cover system. But I think it's a style of gameplay that also hurts the view of Drake's character. Combat breeds a lethal efficiency, thinking about encounters with a mathematical precision. How many guys can you kill as quickly as possible, as safely as possible, and with as little ammo as possible? The combined effect can paint a grim vision of Drake, not as of this scrappy action hero fighting overwhelming odds with a reckless courage and a healthy amount of luck, but of this deliberate killer whose playstyle is indistinguishable from a dozen other military shooters. Part of the reason that players might have dwelled on all the killing is just how much time you have to consider it from behind a chest-high wall. Drake is a character best served by a forward momentum, always moving and improvising, throwing a punch here and there, and not thinking too hard about getting the perfect headshot. In short, acting like an action hero. Thankfully, the series gets a lot better at capitalizing on this momentum, with crenellated arenas that give you more flexibility in how you take on enemies, a greater focus on melee combat, with some areas being solely dedicated to it. and, most importantly, a steady stream of ridiculous set pieces that always keep you on the move. By Uncharted 4, a series that was once this fairly conservative shooter becomes much more vibrant, grappling about to avoid gunfire or landing an aerial takedown that has Nate nab an enemy weapon in the process. I really think that if the older games had played like this, the action would never have been questioned, as it finally feels like a playable action movie.
Whoa!
There's something disconcerting about this character lining up shots with a magnum, but him and Elena doing a combo takedown? There's nothing to think about, it's just awesome.
Nice.
And the Lost Legacy gets the benefit from all this, playing identically to 4, so you get even more rope swinging, drop kicking, and jeep hijacking action.
Out you go!
The only real change between the two is the emphasis placed on stealth. It's not complex, but I found myself playing more sneakily here than I ever did in the prior games. This led to what was the biggest distinction between playing as Nate and Chloe, where I found myself adopting something of a canon playstyle when playing as Drake, pushing myself to stay on the move and utilizing melee attacks as much as possible. I did this because, in reality, it's still entirely possible to hunker down behind cover, moving only when absolutely necessary, or silently killing every guard one by one. The difference is that the later games made the more improvisational style more feasible, or sometimes allowing you to sneak through areas without killing anyone at all.
Okay. I don't think anyone saw me. So long, boys.
I chose to play that way because that's how I viewed his character. Things like stealth takedowns or sniping felt wrong to me, a little too premeditated. And this probably sounds a bit much, playing in such a hyper-specific way, but I think it speaks to my investment in the narrative of these games that I actually wanted the combat to reflect what I saw of Nate in the cutscenes.
Oh, that's brilliant. Guns? What are you thinking?
Relax, Gandhi. They're tranquilizer guns, totally non-lethal. Your conscience will remain unscathed.
I think the developers may have felt this way too. I mentioned being able to sneak through areas without killing anyone, but the only reason I knew about this was because I was looking through the game's trophy list. Without it, I probably wouldn't have even considered it an option, but when I did play this way, suddenly Drake's character in the cutscenes afterwards made a lot more sense.
Put it down.
It's done. Okay? It's done.
Don't worry, Nadine. It's not their style.
I say, I didn't think he had it in him.
It's not their style actually seems like it speaks to Drake not killing people at every opportunity and only when he's ambushed. I really do appreciate the inclusion of these pacifist sections, but I find it odd that these sorts of approaches weren't more emphasized in the game itself. If the option had been highlighted by an on-screen prompt, it probably would have been widely praised as an alternative for players who are hesitant to mow everyone down, and not something that just a % of players would get to experience. With Frazier, there was never this hesitation, and her more mercenary attitude had me flowing from one style of gameplay to the next without any reservations. Whether I was crashing into an enemy base with a total disregard for subtlety, or cutting through an enemy patrol with a suppressed pistol, it all felt in character for her.
Huh? Safety's off.
The combat doesn't exist in a vacuum though, and it's worth discussing the forces you spend so much time fighting. These are games where you spend about half your time shooting guys, but the first encounter with them still manages to be jarring. For example, in Uncharted 2, the first bit of combat sees you sneaking into a dig site run by what the story tells us is a psychopathic mercenary.
What do you mean they?
Flynn and his client, Lazarevich.
You know, the nutcase. They've been working together all along.
And when you get there, you see some of his mercenaries just hanging out. As our introduction to what will be the main enemies of the game, it's strange, where they don't look particularly evil. And it makes the combat that follows seem kind of hollow, where Drake and Sully fight a small army of guys that we don't get a sense of until a few minutes later, in Nepal. It's then made clear that the fighting from here on out is one of survival, that this is an army that will destroy entire cities to get what they want. These are guys that can fight. A few details can really shape our understanding of a character, so it's important that the ones we see for the villains and henchmen of Uncharted paint them in as evil a light as possible.
I am surrounded by traitors and fools!
The main antagonists are generally well established, committing some heinous act within minutes of their introduction, but it's the henchmen that never seem to get the same treatment, and it can make sections of combat feel artificial at best, or at worst, actively uncomfortable.
The damn thing is always breaking down.
Come on, let's just fix it so we can get out of here.
Look, they're not armed.
For example, what we learn of Shoreline, the mercenaries that serve as the main enemies of Uncharted 4, is oddly ambiguous. Over the course of 10 hours, you find that they've helped some rebels overthrow a government, that the guys in Shoreline hate Rafe almost as much as you do.
I nearly blew my goddamn arms off only to get chewed out by that prick. I should have bopped him.
The guys fronting our entire crew.
And that they're hurting for money.
He needs their muscle and they need his money.
They do? They seem pretty well stocked.
Shoreline got involved in a couple of civil wars that didn't pan out for them.
It's a strange collection of traits, not really good, but also not so unambiguously evil as to make killing hordes of these guys cathartic. I know that Joseph Anderson mentioned this point as well in his review of the series, but it's worth restating. In fact, I tried to go out of my way to find some details that might make them out to be a bit more villainous. Instead, I found myself relating to them, hearing them heckle each other or peering in on some guards watching football in the same shitty break room that seems to exist for every minimum wage job around the world. They reminded me of my old coworkers and my own personal resume of terrible jobs.
I was following her order.
Still, what do you think she'd do?
Turn me inside out.
Exactly. Take some deep breaths and go walk it off.
It's characterization that's counterproductive, humanizing the enemies who you'll momentarily gun down, in a title that wants the action to be uncomplicated and fun.
Go where the money leads you.
Let's go.
It gets colder. I'm gonna take a leak while you educate our young recruit here.
I wonder how differently I'd view the games if the grunts were better established earlier on. We shouldn't just be told offhandedly about how evil these characters are. We need to see it, to experience it. Even something like seeing the mercenaries in Borneo tossing dead bodies into a pit would be a much stronger introduction to them. A vision of how these guys operate. And these details are also what I find so effective about the opening of The Lost Legacy. In the span of about 10 minutes, you'll get a fuller understanding of the enemies you'll be spending the game fighting than in any other entry in the series. Asav and his rebels presented as thuggish, bullying assholes. We see what life is like for people living under their rule, and a glimpse of what their future might be. And we see what kinds of atrocities the men in Asav's army are willing to commit. How they abuse their power.
How do I know you're not smuggling something in here? Arms up.
Hey.
It's dangerous to be out so late.
Hey! Where do you live? What are you, deaf? Answer him! I said, where do you live?
As a result, by the time the game opens up to the first combat encounter where you ambush a group of enemies, there's never that jarring feeling. Our characters and their motivations are clear, the enemies and their willingness to use lethal force well established by this point. I hadn't just been told they were bad, I'd experienced it, and it did make combat a great deal more satisfying. The irony is that because of the change in leads, The Lost Legacy probably could have gotten away with jumping straight into the next snapping action. It was the older games that would have really benefited from an opening sequence that was this effective at establishing its enemies. I hesitate to rattle off a series of changes, games criticism as a set of hypothetical patch notes, but the essence of it comes back down to the issue of character. Does what you're doing in the game reflect how this character you spend so much time with would act? When playing as Drake, so often the answer felt like no, and it did take me out of the experience for a bit, before the next set piece, the next plot point pulled me back in. I hope I've presented why it bothered me and how The Lost Legacy addressed those issues. Create action and scenarios that stay true to the characters at the heart of the game, and you'll make something where players won't think about the mechanisms of the experience, but just enjoy the ride. Thanks for watching.